Welcome. In this episode, we will conclude our study of ancient Rome with several key highlights that help explain how and why the world is the way it is. First, a key aspect of Roman law. The Romans had a wide-reaching code of laws that covered a wide number of scenarios, particularly if you happen to be a Roman citizen, but there were laws that covered all sorts of things, and this spread throughout that Pax Romana, embedding a sense of Roman law for hundreds of years in all of these areas that would persist for hundreds of years and continue to influence us today. Another aspect of ancient Rome that is derivative for the rest of the world and world history is the language of Latin. Latin was the language of the Romans. A synonym for that is that they were Romance or Roman languages. They were not like kissy kissy lovey dovey romantic. They were Romance or Roman languages are derivative from Latin. So French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian are all languages that derive from Latin that is spread all over the world. You can see like French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian as well, Italian, that is spread to as European countries colonized parts of the world. Those languages became commonplace in many parts of the world as well, and they're all essentially based on Latin, have quite a bit of common vocabulary and language usage that all comes from Latin. And you might say, well, how did they develop into different languages? We today think about how different areas might simply develop their own dialect. In the United States, for example, where everyone, in theory, everyone speaks English, but you also have a wide variety of accents and dialects, and those happen just in various regions. Well, when the Roman Empire fell, everyone spoke Latin, but they didn't have contact with each other in the way that they had during the days of the empire, so that people pick up inside jokes and different words for things and different pronunciations catch on, so much so for hundreds of years that they became distinct independent languages. And so in world history, in a way, we can say to have had, in a way, three relatively universal languages, or languages that spread way beyond their own usage. Latin was that first one that people even outside of the Latin world used and spoke Latin. We still, in the Catholic Church, there is still a lot of use of Latin. In scientific taxonomy of creatures, they still use a Latin word to distinguish animals and plants as a way for those terms to be universal among all people. In the 16 and 1700s, that universal language became French, so that we have the phrase lingua franca, that literally in French just means the French language. But when we today use the phrase lingua franca, we mean a universal language that all can understand, because for hundreds of years, to be an educated person, you really had to know French. Often you had to know Latin and French and Greek and several other languages, but for hundreds of years, the universal language was French, so that we can say that lingua franca refers to a universal language. And in more modern times, we've actually seen that, conveniently for most of us, become English in the world. That English has kind of become a universal language, a Latin, a lingua franca, that if you speak English, you can travel to many, many parts of the world and are often able to find people that speak English, because it is considered, for better or for worse, somewhat of a universal language around the world, which is very convenient for those who speak English today, for those who spoke French hundreds of years ago, and for those who spoke Latin in the ancient world. Next, the rise of Christianity. So Christianity began as a small persecuted cult coming out of Palestine, out of the Jewish people, and very quickly, largely with the apostles Peter and especially Paul, spread throughout the Roman Empire. It was largely a small persecuted minority. It began to grow in size, numbers, and significance. The persecution was often uneven. It was not just consistently persecuted. There were 3 or 5 emperors who were very savage in their persecution of the Christians. Many of the other ones were much more benign. Key to the persecution of the Christians was the Greek and Roman pantheon. Remember, they are polytheistic, worshiping or revering many gods. And so when the Roman emperors claimed to also be a god, most people in this pagan polytheistic world did not have a problem with that. And they simply added the emperor to their list of gods. But to the monotheistic Jews and eventually Christians, they resisted that and would not yield to the emperor as a god. And so that was often key to the distinction and the persecution. You had the Emperor Constantine in 313 famously convert, I believe late in his life, and issue an edict of toleration. But then very quickly, Christianity went from being persecuted to being tolerated to being the official religion of the empire due to the conversion of the emperor himself. The Romans were continued many of the Greek arts, yes, paintings. They were very big into sculpture, and maybe we only know that because that's what especially survived. But again, the busts and the statues and the working of marble, the architecture are all very influenced by the Greeks and those that we still have today. The Romans are even as famous or more than the Greeks for their architecture. Their aqueducts, the root there, aqua, and a duct being something that carries something, like we might have an air duct in our home that carries air. An aqueduct carries aqua, or water. These, the Romans built. Here's an example of an aqueduct. Many of them that survive today are actually in Spain, but there were very famous aqueducts that ported water from faraway freshwater sources to big cities. There were many large cities that were allowed to flourish due to the success of the Roman armies that kept attackers, would-be attackers, at bay. And here's a picture of some of those barbarians or would-be attackers standing in the heart of Rome after having conquered it, which we'll get to in just a moment. The aqueducts, the famous Roman Colosseum, the sort of sports arena where they would have all sorts of blood sport. One of their famous types was to actually fill stadiums with water and reenact naval battles. They would actually fill them with several feet of water and have small boats fight each other while people were amused. Another famous phrase that comes from ancient Rome is this idea of bread and circuses. And this refers to the Colosseums where you would have unrest or the potential for riot or revolution, and the emperors would offer free bread or have a circus or entertainment or spectacle that would entertain the people and take their mind off things. So there are those who still use this phrase today, that whenever the government wants to distract people from their problems, they should offer bread and circuses, give out free food, free money, and offer exciting entertainment to distract us from our real problems. And that's an idea that comes from the Roman Empire. Also from architecture, the Romans were very famous for their use of concrete, and they were able to construct all sorts of things that other people up to that point were not able to, and it is a revolution in Roman construction architecture. The Romans used a lot of domes. Famously, they could construct with concrete, a lot of the Roman arch, and the Romans were massive road builders. There, it gives rise to the phrase that all roads lead to Rome. This map doesn't show that diagram, but that's just a saying that is given rise in this time because the Romans were such famous road builders. Lastly, the legacy of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will fall around 476, around the year 500, but for centuries and centuries after, there would be this entity called the Holy Roman Empire. We'll talk about this country that maybe many of you are unfamiliar with. It would ultimately kind of become Germany and centered in Vienna, Austria, but it would still be called the Holy Roman Empire, which is probably, again, to that point that the Roman Empire and ancient Rome has this reputation for being the good old days. What gives it that reputation? The barbarian attacks. There are many aspects of material life that were destroyed, and people's standard of living goes way down. And so there is this thing in people's memory that people used to have it better. There were the good old days when Rome was still around, and then it fell. Another major legacy is the major eastern-western split in the empire. This map doesn't show it. This one does, where you had actually in the 300s, the emperor split the empire. And actually, the eastern half tended to be more Greek-speaking, tended to be more urbanized, richer, and they set up a new capital on the Bosporus Strait at Constantinople, named after Emperor Constantine, or it'd be Constantine City. And the western half of the empire continued to be run from Rome. So already in the 300s, some of the problems of Rome are already being seen. But that east-west split is a legacy that we'll see continue. And with the eastern half having its capital at the old city called Byzantium, then Constantinople, and it is the modern-day city of Istanbul in modern-day Turkey. And lastly, the decline, the fall of Rome. There are those who think it was this abrupt fall, like Rome was perfectly fine, and then it had this abrupt fall. Others say, yeah, it was in its death throes. It was declining for a long time. When do we mark the actual fall of Rome? In 410, Rome was sacked. A barbarian army had made it through. And I believe the first ones were the Vandals, where we get the phrase vandalism. They were the barbarians who first sacked the city of Rome. And again, rape, loot, pillage, murder, burning, destruction. This was a catastrophic event, but Rome kind of recovered, and they still had other emperors for most of a century. In 476, Rome was attacked and sacked again, only this time the barbarian Germanic ruler that murders the emperor and declares himself the emperor of Rome. And so Rome says it's still going. It's just now, instead of a Roman emperor, you have this German attacker who thinks that if you kill the king, you can become the new king. Why would they have that idea? Well, unfortunately, because of the assassination of emperors that had become very commonplace in the late empire. The army had begun to routinely assassinate the emperor, and then a top general would become the emperor. There were periods where, I believe in like a 17-year period, there were something like 34 assassinations where an emperor was killed. There were certain years or strings of months where the government fell several times due to assassination, and this became a very unfortunate legacy that helped bring down Rome. There are those who point to what else brought down Rome: a lack of military patriotism, that they had grown kind of complacent, that the empire was strong and should protect them, and there was a lack of volunteerism for the Roman army, that they had actually begun to hire foreigners, to hire these barbarians and sort of pay them tribute to basically watch the borders for them. And we don't know exactly why these barbarian waves happened in the 3 and the 400s especially, but it just so happens that in the 2, 3, 400s, this pressure, was it due to climate? Was there shortages of food in these areas that pushed people into the nicer Roman Empire? Was it that the Roman army was just that much weaker? Were there other barbarians further out in Central Asia that were attacking these more civilized, Romanized barbarians that then pushed them into the Roman Empire? We don't know. We really don't know. But we do know that Rome did fall, and that these outsiders kind of came in, took over, and the Roman way of life did in many ways collapse, except for this legacy of Rome that we still have. And we have these, many of these barbarian tribes are still significant. We still think of things as being Gothic. We still know what vandalism is. The Franks become the French. The Angles and Saxons migrate to Anglo-Saxon Britain. The Utes in the Uteland of Denmark, the Utes. And so Rome was brought down by many different Germanic barbarian tribes, and it will give way to this period known as the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, which will be the topic of our next video. Thanks for watching.